This exchange perfectly captures the growing disconnect between wealthy political elites and the reality most Americans are actually living through right now. Before we break it all down, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you think about this debate. Kevin O'Leary went on CNN Newsnight with Abby Phillip and once again proved just how disconnected wealthy Trump allies are from the reality most Americans are actually living through right now. During this panel, O'Leary seriously tried to use a Disney earnings call and theme park attendance as evidence that the U.S. economy is supposedly thriving under Donald Trump's policies, even while Americans are drowning in credit card debt, struggling with grocery prices, rising utility bills, and trying to survive paycheck to paycheck. What made this exchange so revealing is that even some conservatives on the panel were forced to acknowledge the obvious contradiction. Trump officials are out here celebrating rising credit card spending as a sign of confidence, while ordinary people are using those cards because basic necessities are becoming harder to afford. Abby Phillip and the rest of the panel pushed back hard on this idea that mounting debt somehow equals economic strength, and it exposed the exact same kind of elite detachment Republicans spent years accusing Democrats of having during the Biden administration. But the bigger issue here goes beyond Kevin O'Leary himself. This clip perfectly highlights what happens when a government packed with billionaires tries to lecture working people about the economy. Trump's administration is the wealthiest administration in modern American history, filled with billionaires and multimillionaires who simply do not experience economic hardship the way average Americans do. And when people that wealthy start using Disney vacations, stock market earnings, and investor calls as proof that everyday Americans are doing great, it shows just how far removed they are from the people they claim to represent.
Tonight, the Trump administration is celebrating a potentially alarming trend, claiming it's a sign of consumer confidence. Trump's top economic advisor says the American consumer is, quote, really firing on all cylinders for this puzzling reason.
I had the head of one of the big five banks in my office yesterday going through the credit card data, and just as Secretary Bessent said, credit card spending is through the roof. They're spending more on gasoline, but they're spending more on everything else, too.
Today, Kevin Hassett credited Trump's no tax on tips, overtime, and Social Security policies for putting so much more money in Americans' pockets. But notably absent from that list, Trump's tariffs, which are said to have cost the average American family over $1,700. Kevin, the other Kevin, look, I'm sure that there are plenty of economic people who can make a good case for why people spending themselves into debt is a good thing for the economy, sure. But for actual American pocketbooks, when you are spending yourself on credit cards, it's usually a sign that things are not going well with your cash flow.
It's very interesting what's happening because I was listening to the Disney call, the earnings call, which is such a great index for consumers. Think about families going to theme parks, buying gasoline, buying stuff. So the Disney, this is a new CEO, it's his first call, was asked right out of the gate, because every analyst is trying to figure out where the consumer stands, have you seen a slowdown in park traffic? Remember, parks are more expensive than they've ever been, and the cost of taking your family in the car should be more expensive than ever, because it's gas $4 to $5 now. Zero change in traffic. In fact, it's up. And so what is happening to this economy that people feel confident enough to see forward to the end of whatever this volatility is, particularly on gas prices? The truth is 50% of the S&P 500 companies have absorbed the tariffs themselves by using AI to increase their margins and productivity. So the full weight of tariffs hasn't ever affected the consumer yet because of this incredible productivity enhancement, this serendipitous tool that Trump never saw coming called AI in all 11 sectors. The earnings are stunning in the S&P 500, which is the index of everybody that saves money, that is saving anything in their savings account in America, driven by the power of an economy that seems to be ignoring the conflict in the Middle East. You would think, given all of this volatility, that somehow it would affect something in America.
Well, I mean, Kevin Hassett is telling us it is.
Nothing yet.
But Kevin Hassett is telling us, I mean, just to ask you to respond to what he said. He said Americans are spending more on credit cards, that they are not only paying more, they are paying more for things that they are buying, but they're doing so on credit cards. That's what he's saying. That's
the amount that Americans are carrying on their credit card has increased. It's gone up to almost $7,000 per person. A lot of Americans are making minimum payments. The average interest rate is between 21 and 22% on whatever balance they are carrying. And then you've got the chief economic advisor to Donald Trump out there with a shit-eating grin, telling us how great it is that American debt is increasing, that the average American's debt is increasing. I just think it speaks again to this constant theme I see from this administration, which is tone deafness, right? Oh, it's just a little short-term pain. Oh, buy your daughter less dolls. Oh, it's, you know, it's worth the little pain they're feeling. Oh, it's great that they've got more credit card debt. I mean, I would say that if I'm a person who can't pay my gas, whose dollar is going a lot less far in the grocery store, who is stuck in Fort Lauderdale Airport without being able to get back home because Spirit Airlines no longer exists. I hear this guy, and I'm not happy about it.
I think, and that is kind of the difference. I think that the last Anna and Kevin illustrate the difference in the way that I think many Americans are viewing it. And for a long period of time, Democrats had their head in the sand about things like the economy, inflation, particularly, and crime, right? I mean, we spent before in 2020 to 2024, talking about the messaging that Democrats didn't get right around immigration, crime, and inflation. But Kevin was articulating the fact that a Disney earnings call and people coming to the park could dictate the pulse of what average Americans were feeling. And I would argue that's not quite the case. I think most people are looking at the fact that their electricity bills are rising through the roof. I think that people elected Donald Trump so that their grocery prices would go down, and they have not seen that. I think people are talking about gas and fuel prices. I think most people are not necessarily talking about Disney per se, but instead they're talking about how to make their everyday ends meet. Of course, we are.
I mean, Disney, to your point, is a luxury item.
Luxury? I mean, yes. I went on a Disney cruise and realized I had to work more years just to pay for it. So, yes, I understand that.
Abby, I think Kevin said something that I think is a good point, and that has to do with confidence. People have some confidence about what's going on in the future. There were two numbers that came out this week that I think illustrate that. One is the ADP hiring report. They forecast 109,000 jobs added. The other thing was that the U.S. hiring rate jumped to 3.5% in March, which is a 22-month high, and we're still sort of in a, what do they call, low hire, low fire, so sort of a muted turnover in the labor market. So I think there are jobs being added. People aren't worried about necessarily losing their jobs. So I think what Kevin was, maybe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but there is a little bit of confidence among the American workforce about, hey, my job is okay, and I feel good about the future.
Can I ask you both just a question? This is just a literal question. I'm kind of taking Abby's role, I guess. But how do you say that we are not necessarily losing jobs and their confidence in the job market, but yet talk about the bolstering of AI? Because a lot of the same people that we're talking about who are in these jobs that pay between minimum wage and maybe, you know, $20 an hour, those are going to be the same jobs in the next 5 to 10 years that are going to be excommunicated because of AI. So what is the balance there, and how we
loss of all jobs, and you're not seeing any new jobs that may be higher paying coming from AI? And I'll give you an example of exactly that. So people that used to look at the tops of Target stores and Walmart stores to look for every year cracks that they have to cover for insurance, that no longer is done by people going up ladders anymore. It's done by drones. And the people that fly the drones make 10 times more than the guys that went up the ladders.
So what happens to the people who went up the ladders?
Listen, the point is they...
No. I like a very specific question. So what happened? So that's my point. What happens to the people who went up the ladders?
They learned how to fly drones. That's what happened to them.
But
they
we're not investing in that.
They start making a lot more money. I mean, the point is, you make the assumption there's no mobility, that people are stuck in something they're doing when they're 28 or 38 years old. They're not stupid. They learn how to do new things. They're accommodating them.
I'll tell you one other thing. I interviewed a CEO actually on my radio show today who is head of this company. They make semiconductors, and because of the AI, you asked about AI, because of the boom, they're now currently building an advanced manufacturing plant in Greenville, North Carolina, that will add between 400 and 600 jobs in an advanced manufacturing setting. These people make a ton of money. The only reason they're building it is because they are the backbone that goes into NVIDIA. And so when you look at the interplay across AI, you can see there is manufacturing being added in a place like North Carolina. People are going to make a ton of money. It's only because of the AI.
So I think all of that is relevant. But I also think, just getting back to where Americans believe the economy is, by every indication, they are pessimistic about where things are. consumer confidence is at, all-time lows. Their confidence in President Trump's handling of the economy is pretty low. And prior to now, I mean, if you look at Trump's first year in office, I keep repeating this because I think it's important to note when we talk about tariffs, it's not just who's paying them, it's also what is the overall effect on the economy. And there were effectively net zero jobs created in his first year in office. So Trump stagnated the economy for a year. Maybe we're coming out of that now, but you can see why Americans are not so sure where this thing is headed. And then they look at gas prices, they look at a war that maybe isn't ending, and they're asking, are you focused on what you said you were going to be focused on, which is raising our incomes, lowering our prices, all of that?
Well, one, I think the president probably recognizes that, which is why he's trying to bring some type of resolution to the conflict with Iran. I think looking at Disney's, their earnings call, that's one key indicator one could look at a segment of the population to give us a tall tale in terms of how they're performing, behaving in terms of spending, et cetera. But when you look at how much does the average American have saved for an emergency, $500, $1,000, most frankly don't. And that sort of worries me. So people can iterate a little bit. They can adjust themselves to AI, et cetera. But that takes time. That doesn't happen overnight. And so for me as a conservative, I certainly want to see us focus a little bit more on making sure the American people have the skills for the jobs that you're talking about, because it will have a significant impact in the next 5 to 10 years. I don't know if Congress as a whole is focused there collectively. I want to see a little bit more of that. But in the immediate, I do think maybe we can try to attempt to pass some legislation, Abby, to provide some relief to people who are struggling, families. Congress can do that. We have a Republican majority. That would certainly benefit us going into the midterms this November. So that's sort of how I'm looking at this.
I mean, what they're doing, though, is allocating $1 billion for a ballroom.
Well, for the bunker,
they're doing a lot of other things that involve spending
Imagine
money.
the Barack Obama ballroom that cost $1 billion.
Well, the $1 billion is separate from the building.
Spending money on many things
Try to
that
deport
don't
them
have
to
do
Kenya.
with affordability over in Washington. Next for us, one CEO.
What really stood out to me about this entire discussion is how it exposed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of modern Republican economic messaging. For years, conservatives attacked Democrats and Joe Biden by saying the administration was ignoring reality. They constantly argued that Democrats were relying on statistics, stock market numbers, unemployment charts, and corporate reports, while ordinary Americans were struggling in their day-to-day lives. That was the entire Republican argument throughout the inflation crisis. They said Democrats were gaslighting people by telling them the economy was strong while families were paying more for food, rent, gas, and utilities. But now look at what's happening. Donald Trump is back in office, prices are still high, Americans are carrying record levels of credit card debt, and suddenly Republicans are now the ones pointing at corporate earnings calls and telling everybody the economy is actually amazing. Suddenly, Disney attendance is supposed to be proof that working-class Americans are thriving. Suddenly, massive consumer spending on credit cards is supposedly evidence of confidence instead of desperation. Suddenly, billionaires are trying to explain to struggling families that everything is actually fine because the S&P 500 is performing well. It is literally the exact same behavior they accuse Democrats of engaging in, except arguably worse because this administration is even more detached from ordinary people than the previous one. And Kevin O'Leary is the perfect embodiment of that detachment. This is a billionaire businessman sitting on television talking about Disney theme parks as a measurement of economic strength, while millions of Americans are deciding whether they can afford groceries, rent, electricity, healthcare, or gas for the week. That alone tells you everything you need to know about how these people view the economy. To wealthy elites, the economy is the stock market, it is investor confidence, it is earnings reports, it is corporate growth. But for ordinary people, the economy is much simpler than that. The economy is, can I afford my bills this month? Can I fill up my car? Can I survive an emergency? Can I afford groceries without using a credit card? That is the real economy. And the panel actually touched on something incredibly important that often gets ignored in these conversations. Rising credit card spending is not automatically a sign of prosperity. In many cases, it is the exact opposite. If people are increasingly relying on debt to maintain their lifestyles while inflation continues squeezing them, that is not economic confidence. That is financial pressure. The average American carrying thousands of dollars in credit card debt at over 20% interest is not thriving. They are surviving. And what makes this even more frustrating is the complete lack of self-awareness coming from Trump officials and Trump-aligned commentators. Kevin Hassett literally smiled while talking about Americans spending more on credit cards. Think about how insane that is. Americans are taking on more debt during a cost of living crisis, and the administration is trying to frame that as positive economic news. That is exactly why people feel like these elites do not understand them. Because they don't. Donald Trump's administration is packed with billionaires, multimillionaires, corporate executives, hedge fund managers, and wealthy investors. These people do not experience inflation the way ordinary Americans experience inflation. They do not walk into grocery stores and worry about prices. They do not panic over gas bills. They do not stress over rent increases. They do not fear a medical emergency wiping out their savings. Most of them could spend more in a single weekend than some American families make in an entire year. So when people like Kevin O'Leary speak about economic hardship, it often sounds clinical and detached because to them it is theoretical. They view the economy from the perspective of markets and investments, not from the perspective of survival. And honestly, this is why the AI conversation in this clip was probably the most revealing part of the entire segment. You had one side talking about AI replacing jobs and displacing workers, which is already happening across industries. And then you had Kevin O'Leary basically saying, well, people will just learn new skills and make more money. Again, that sounds nice in theory, but real life is not that simple. A 50-year-old worker who loses their job to automation cannot always seamlessly transition into a high-paying tech role. A struggling worker living paycheck to paycheck may not have the time, money, or resources to suddenly retrain for a completely different industry. Entire communities can get economically devastated when industries disappear. We have literally seen this happen throughout American history. Manufacturing towns collapsed, coal towns collapsed, entire regions were hollowed out by economic change while politicians promised everybody would simply adapt. Some people do adapt. A lot of people don't. And what frustrates people is that wealthy elites often talk about economic transition like it's a painless process because they themselves are insulated from the consequences. If AI wipes out thousands of jobs, billionaires will still be billionaires. Executives will still get bonuses. Investors will still profit from increased efficiency. But ordinary workers are the ones carrying the actual risk. That is why this conversation matters politically. Because there was a growing gap between how elites define economic success and how ordinary people experience economic reality. And this is where Trump's political brand becomes deeply contradictory. Donald Trump built his entire political identity around the idea that he understood forgotten Americans better than traditional politicians. That was the whole appeal. He positioned himself as the outsider billionaire who supposedly understood working-class frustration. But over time, what we've actually seen is an administration dominated by some of the wealthiest people in modern political history, pushing policies that overwhelmingly benefit corporations, investors, and the ultra-rich. That contradiction becomes impossible to ignore when people are still struggling financially while being told the economy is supposedly booming. And the saddest part is that many working-class voters continue supporting politicians and movements that often do not materially improve their lives. That is not even meant as an insult. It is just political reality. A lot of people vote based on cultural identity, anger, nationalism, frustration, or emotional connection rather than direct economic outcomes. Republicans understand this extremely well. They know how to channel resentment and redirect economic frustration toward immigration, culture wars, media outrage, universities, or elites in blue cities, while simultaneously implementing economic agendas that benefit wealthy donors and corporations. And to be fair, Democrats are not innocent in this broader system either. Democrats have also struggled at times with appearing disconnected from working-class economic frustration. But the difference here is that Republicans spent years attacking Democrats specifically for this exact behavior, only to immediately turn around and do the same thing once back in power. That is why this clip was so revealing, because it exposed how quickly the rhetoric changes depending on who controls the White House. Under Biden, high prices meant economic failure. Under Trump, high prices and rising debts suddenly become evidence of consumer confidence. Under Biden, economic pain was proof the administration was out of touch. Under Trump, economic pain is now framed as temporary sacrifice for future prosperity. It is the exact same playbook they criticized before. And ordinary people notice that hypocrisy. At the end of the day, no amount of Disney earnings calls, stock market growth, or investor optimism changes the reality millions of Americans are facing. If people feel financially trapped, overworked, underpaid, and increasingly dependent on debt just to maintain basic living standards, then no politician or billionaire commentator is going to convince them the economy is amazing simply because corporations are profitable. That disconnect is real. And the more politicians and wealthy media personalities ignore that reality, the more frustration in this country is going to grow.